The US Navy said this man was only qualified to serve soup and shine shoes. They were wrong, because when Pearl Harbor started burning, Doris Miller didn't run to the kitchen. He ran to a machine gun. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. 1 minute. Doris Story. Miller's massive hands are submerged in warm, soapy water, collecting laundry below the deck of the USS West Virginia. The smell of clean linen and bacon grease fills the air. 60 seconds later, those same hands are gripping the vibrating, freezing steel handles of a Browning .50 caliber anti-aircraft machine gun. The barrel is glowing red hot. The air is no longer smelling of breakfast, it reeks of burning oil, cordite, and fear. Here is the paradox that history tried to forget. Miller was a mess attendant, a black man in a segregated navy. His orders were to serve coffee and shine shoes. He was strictly forbidden from touching heavy weaponry. The Navy's official stance was that men like him lacked the technical ability to fight. But as the Japanese Zeros screamed down from the sky, turning the Pacific Fleet into a graveyard, the chain of command disintegrated. With no training, no permission, and the battleship sinking beneath his feet, the man who was only paid to serve breakfast ended up serving death to the Imperial Japanese Navy. He didn't just survive the apocalypse, he became the first man to fire back. But how does a servant become a savior in less than 15 minutes? To understand the insanity of what happened next, you have to understand the invisible cage Doris Miller lived in. He was a giant of a man, 6'3", over 200 pounds of solid muscle. Back in Texas, they called him the Raging Bull because he could plow through defensive lines on the football field like a tank. But on the USS West Virginia, the United States Navy decided his physical power was useless. Why? Because in 1941, the military operated under a strict, unyielding doctrine of segregation. The official policy was simple and brutal. Black sailors were there to serve, not to fight. They believed men like Miller lacked the intelligence and discipline for combat. His rank was Mess Attendant 3rd Class. His battle station was not a gun turret. It was the laundry room below the waterline. His weapon wasn't a rifle. It was a tray of silverware for the white officers. We are about to walk through the moment the sky fell. The moment when the Japanese Empire launched a surprise attack designed to break the American spirit in a single morning. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They didn't account for the man collecting laundry in the dark. This is not just a war story. It is the story of a man who broke the Navy's most sacred rule to save it from total destruction. And it all started when the first torpedo tore through the silence. It was Sunday morning. The air inside the lower decks of the USS West Virginia didn't smell like war. It smelled of bacon grease, fresh coffee, and the damp, metallic scent of the Pacific Ocean. This battleship was a Titan, 33,000 tons of American armor, a floating fortress designed to be unsinkable. For the men on board, this steel cage was the safest place on Earth. But that safety was a lie. 300 miles north, hidden under radio silence, a swarm of death was already in the air. The WWII, the Imperial Japanese Navy's strike force, 6 aircraft carriers, 353 Zeros, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. They weren't just coming to fight, they were coming to erase the Pacific Fleet from existence. 7:55 a.m. The first impact didn't sound like an explosion. It felt like the ocean itself had punched the ship in the gut. The floorboards buckled, the lights flickered and died, plunging the lower decks into a suffocating darkness. Then came the second. And the third, 7. The USS West Virginia took 7 Mark 95 aerial torpedoes to her port side. These weren't just bombs. They were underwater predators, designed to tear steel open like wet paper. The sound of metal screaming as it twisted was louder than the sirens, but the torture wasn't over. From the clouds, high-altitude bombers dropped armor-piercing shells. They smashed through the reinforced decks, burrowing deep into the ship's entrails before detonating. The galley, the laundry room, the sleeping quarters, places of rest and routine were instantly transformed into a meat grinder of fire and shrapnel. In 12 minutes, the pride of the fleet was a burning coffin, listing 28 degrees into the mud of the harbour. The water rushing into the hallways wasn't clean. It was a thick, black sludge of heavy fuel oil, and it was on fire. The air turned into a toxic cocktail of sulphur, burning flesh, and the copper tang of blood. On the bridge, the brain of the ship, Captain Mervyn Benyon, was gutted. A fragment from a bomb had torn his stomach open. He was holding his own intestines in his hands, refusing to leave his post, while the officers around him froze in sheer terror. The chain of command was broken. The guns were silent. The invincible American Navy was paralyzed, blinded, and drowning in its own blood. In this apocalypse, protocol dictates that a man with no combat training should evacuate immediately. He is a liability. He is in the way. The captain is dying. The ship is capsizing. The sky is full of enemies. By all logic, the USS West Virginia is already dead. But amidst the smoke and the screaming, one man ignored the protocol. He wasn't an officer. He wasn't a soldier. He was the man who collected the dirty laundry. And he was about to do something that would force the United States Navy to rewrite its entire history. His name was Doris Miller, but everyone called him Doree. He was 22 years old, born on a cotton farm in Waco, Texas, and he was built like a monolith. At 6'3" and over 200 pounds, Miller was a physical anomaly in the Navy's segregated ranks. Back in high school, they didn't just call him big, they called him the Raging Bull. On the football field, he was a force of nature. He didn't just tackle opponents, he ran through them. He possessed a raw, kinetic power that commanded respect. But in 1939, when he enlisted in the United States Navy to escape the poverty of the Great Depression, he discovered that his strength meant nothing to the military hierarchy. The Navy saw his size, his discipline, and his potential, and they gave him a white apron. Because of the color of his skin, Doree Miller was designated a mess attendant. This wasn't just a job title, it was a ceiling. It meant he could serve food, shine shoes, make beds, and do laundry. It meant he was explicitly forbidden from training with weapons. He could not be an officer. He could not be a gunner. He was essentially a servant in uniform. While white sailors practiced loading shells and aiming anti-aircraft guns, Miller was below deck, perfecting the shine on an officer's shoes. But Doree Miller had a secret. He was observant. While he was serving coffee on the bridge, while he was collecting laundry near the gun turrets, he was watching. He watched how the gunners' mates loaded the ammunition belts. He watched how they adjusted the azimuth. He watched how they cleared jams. He absorbed the mechanics of war through osmosis, silently, invisibly. He knew the weight of the .50 caliber rounds, not because he fired them, but because he had felt the vibration of the ship when others did. On the morning of December 7th, Miller wasn't thinking about heroism. He was thinking about laundry. He had woken up at 6 a.m. to serve breakfast, and by 7:55 a.m. he was collecting dirty linens. Then the world ended. When the general quarters alarm screamed, Miller didn't hide. He ran toward the chaos. He arrived on the bridge to find a scene from a nightmare. Captain Benyon was down. The man who commanded the ship, the authority figure Miller had served every day, was now lying in a pool of his own blood, his abdomen ripped open. The other officers were paralyzed. The captain was dead weight, literally. But Miller didn't see a rank. He saw a man. Using that legendary Raging Bull strength, Miller scooped up the dying captain and carried him through the fire and oil to a sheltered spot behind the conning tower. He shielded him with his own body, but saving the captain wasn't enough. The Japanese planes were coming back. A second wave of 170 aircraft was diving toward the harbor, strafing the deck with machine gun fire. Miller looked up. 2 Browning .50 caliber machine guns were sitting idle on the deck. The gunners were dead. The weapons were unmanned. The ship was defenseless. In that split second, Doree Miller faced a choice that was more dangerous than the bombs falling around him. The Navy's regulations were clear. A black mess attendant touching a weapon of war was a court-martial offense. It was insubordination. It was a crime. If he fired that gun and missed, he would be a criminal. If he fired that gun and hit, he might change the world. But he had never fired a machine gun in his life. He had only watched. The Zeros were diving. The bullets were chewing up the deck inches from his feet. The raging bull stepped up to the gun. He didn't ask for permission. He just grabbed the handles. The Browning M2, 50 caliber machine gun, is not a toy. It is an instrument of pure destruction. It weighs 84 pounds. It fires rounds as thick as your thumb at a rate of 600 per minute. When you pull the trigger, it doesn't just shoot, it roars. The recoil is violent enough to bruise your shoulder bone if you don't know how to brace yourself. Dory Miller had never fired one. He had never even loaded one. But as the Japanese torpedo bombers banked low over the harbor, lining up for their kill shots on the crippled West Virginia, Miller didn't hesitate. He grabbed the ammo belt. His hands, usually so gentle with china plates, were now wrestling with cold, oiled brass. He fed the belt into the receiver. Click-clack, the sound of the bolt slamming home was the only thing louder than his own heartbeat. He swung the heavy barrel skyward. 8:54 a.m. The second wave of the attack was at its peak. 170 enemy aircraft swarmed like angry hornets. Miller squeezed the butterfly trigger. The gun exploded to life. The vibration rattled his teeth. The heat from the barrel radiated onto his face. He wasn't aiming with sights or calculations. He was aiming with pure, unadulterated instinct. He watched the tracer's glowing lines of red phosphorus streak through the smoke, adjusting his fire like he was spraying a water hose. It wasn't hard, he would later tell the investigators, his voice calm, almost detached. I just pulled the trigger and she worked fine. I had watched the others. Think about that statement. I had watched the others. While he was invisible to them, they were visible to him. He had learned the art of war by being a shadow in the room. A Japanese Zero, low and fast, dove toward the ship. Miller tracked it. He led the target. The tracers connected. Smoke poured from the plane's engine. It shuddered in the air, then spiraled down, crashing into the harbor with a geyser of water and flame. He didn't stop. He kept firing. Another plane. And another. For 15 minutes. Doris Miller was not a mess attendant. He was not a second-class citizen. He was a warrior. He stood his ground on a burning, sinking ship, while the world around him disintegrated. He fired until the ammo belt ran dry. He fired until the barrel was so hot it could melt skin. By the time the gun fell silent, Miller had potentially downed between 4 and 6 enemy aircraft, 4 to 6, with zero training, in the middle of an inferno. But as the adrenaline faded, a new reality set in. The West Virginia was groaning. She was listing dangerously. The order to abandon ship echoed through the smoke. Miller looked at his hands. They were covered in oil, gunpowder, and the blood of the men he couldn't save. He had broken every rule in the book. He had done the impossible. But now, the smoke was clearing. And when the smoke clears, people start looking for who to blame or who to erase. 9 a.m. The guns finally go silent. The USS West Virginia has settled into the mud of the harbor. She is burning. She is broken. Doris Miller stands on the oil-slicked deck, his white uniform now stained black with grease and the blood of the men he carried. His chest is heaving. His ears are ringing so loudly he can barely hear the order to abandon ship. He looks at his hands, the hands of a cook that just minutes ago were vibrating with the power of a machine gun. He slides down a line into the water. He swims through the burning oil to the shore of Ford Island. He survives, and this is where the battle should have ended. But for Doris Miller, the real war had just begun. Here is the twist that history almost successfully hid from you. On the 1st of January 1942, the U.S. Navy released its official list of commendations for the bravery shown at Pearl Harbor. It was a long list. It contained the names of officers, gunners, and pilots. It detailed their heroism in glowing terms. But there was a ghost on that list. Deep in the report, there was a single line. It mentioned a nameless Negro mess attendant who had shown extraordinary courage. Nameless. Think about the violence of that word. He hadn't just carried the captain. He hadn't just fired back when the trained soldiers were dead. He had stood tall against the Japanese Empire, and the Navy's response was to steal his name. They didn't want a hero. They wanted a rumor. They wanted the deed without the man, because acknowledging the man meant acknowledging that their entire system of segregation was a lie. If a cook could fight like a soldier, why was he still only allowed to peel potatoes? The Navy thought the story would end there. A nameless footnote in a dusty file. But they forgot about the power of the press. Specifically, the black press. The Pittsburgh Courier, one of the most influential black newspapers in America, caught wind of the rumor. They didn't accept the nameless narrative. They sent reporters digging. They hunted for witnesses. They tracked down the ship's roster. They turned this into a detective story where the victim was the truth. And then they found him. On the 14th of March 1942, the headline screamed across the country. It was Dory Miller. It wasn't a polite applause. It was an explosion. The story became a weapon. The WWII campaign was born victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. Miller became the face of a paradox that America could no longer ignore. How can you ask a man to die for a country that won't even write down his name? The pressure became suffocating. The Navy, the White House, the President himself, they were cornered. They had tried to bury him, but they had accidentally planted a seed. The 27th of May, 1942, the deck of the USS Enterprise. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, stands before Doris Miller. He holds the Navy Cross, the second highest award for valor in combat. As Nimitz pins the medal onto Miller's chest, you can hear the sharp click of the clasp. It is the sound of a barrier breaking. It is the sound of the Navy admitting they were wrong, without saying a word. Miller stands there, stoic. He doesn't smile. He knows that this medal doesn't change his rank. Tomorrow, he will go back to the kitchen, but in this moment, under the Pacific sun, the nameless servant has forced the most powerful military on earth to look him in the eye and call him a hero. For decades, Doris Miller was just a whisper, a rumor on the docks, a footnote in a classified file. If the black press hadn't fought for him, if the community hadn't demanded the truth, that Navy Cross would have likely remained in a drawer, and his name would have been washed away with the oil and the tide at Pearl Harbor. It makes you stop and wonder. How many brave souls vanished into the smoke of World War II, their stories dying with them, labeled simply as unknown because they didn't fit the image of a hero? We are building a digital monument right here, right now, not just for Miller, but for every forgotten soldier who fought on two fronts, the enemy abroad and the prejudice at home. If you believe that courage has no color, and that a hero's name should never be erased by history, I need you to do one thing. Go down to the comments section, type 2 words, remember Dory. Let's force the algorithm to push this story so far and so wide that history can never ignore him again. Let's make sure the world knows the name of the man who fought back. But while Miller finally had his name, he was about to run out of time. The Navy Cross did not buy Doris Miller a promotion to the gunnery crew. It did not buy him a seat at the officers' table. It bought him a ticket to a war bond tour. For months, the first black hero of World War II was paraded across the United States like a circus attraction. He shook hands with politicians who wouldn't let him vote. He smiled for photographs with admirals who wouldn't let him eat in the same mess hall. He gave speeches to raise money for a war machine that still viewed him as a liability. Internal monologue. They love the medal. They love the story. But they do not love the man. I am a prop, and a prop cannot fight. Miller requested a transfer. He begged to go back to the Pacific. He didn't want to be a symbol. He wanted to be a sailor. In the spring of 1943, the Navy finally granted his wish. They assigned him to a new ship, but this was not a floating fortress like the USS West Virginia. This was the USS Liscum Bay CVE 56. Technically, she was a Casablanca-class escort carrier. Practically, the sailors called them jeep carriers, or baby flat-tops. They were mass-produced, welded together quickly to support amphibious landings. They were slow, they were thin-skinned, and they had a fatal design flaw: tech detail. The Liscum Bay carried over 200,000 gallons of aviation fuel and thousands of pounds of aircraft bombs. But to save weight and build time, the ship's armor plating was almost non-existent. Worse, the bomb magazine, the room storing all the explosives, was located dangerously close to the fuel tanks, with very little protection against underwater attacks. The 24th of November 1943, the Gilbert Islands, 5 a.m. The Liscum Bay is prowling the dark waters off the coast of Makin Atoll. She is part of Operation Galvanic. On board, Dory Miller is awake. He is a cook third class now. A promotion in name, but his hands are still covered in flour and grease, preparing breakfast for the crew. The ocean is pitch black. The radar is spinning. But the technology of 1943 has blind spots. Deep beneath the surface, hidden by the thermal layers of the ocean, is the Japanese submarine I-175. Its commander, Lieutenant Commander Sunao Tabata, is watching through the periscope. He sees the silhouette of the carrier against the faint moonlight. He calculates the distance. He orders. The tubes, flooded. Sensory. On the Liscum Bay, there is the smell of brewing coffee and the hum of the ventilation fans. It is the quietest moment of the day, the calm before the sunrise. 5:10 a.m. The lookout on the starboard side screams, "Torpedo! Starboard flank!" But physics is cruel. By the time you see the white wake of a long-lance torpedo in the dark, you are already dead. The torpedo from I-175 doesn't just hit the ship. It hits the one spot that turns a vessel into a nuclear bomb. It strikes aft of the engine room, punching directly into the aircraft bomb magazine. Micro-pacing. Let's slow this second down. When the torpedo detonates, it triggers a sympathetic explosion of the ship's own arsenal. Thousands of pounds of bombs, intended for the enemy, ignite simultaneously. Sensory. The sound isn't a bang. It is a tectonic crack that splits the sky. The sailors on nearby ships miles away are knocked off their feet by the shockwave. They look over and see a column of fire shooting 1,000 feet into the air. The Liscum Bay doesn't sink. She disintegrates. Shrapnel rains down on the fleet like a meteor shower. Metal, glass, and burning oil coat the sea for a mile in every direction. On the West Virginia, Miller had 15 minutes to be a hero. He had time to run, to carry, to shoot. He had agency. On the Liscum Bay, there is no time, there is no decision to make. The entire stern of the ship vanishes in a heartbeat. The floor drops out from under the galley. The heat is instantaneous and absolute. There is no gun to grab this time. There is no captain to save. There is only the fire. The ship, listing to starboard, sinks in 23 minutes. But for most of the crew, it was over in 23 seconds. Of the 916 men on board, 644 are killed. It is the deadliest sinking of a carrier in U.S. naval history. Among the missing is Cook Third Class Doris Miller. He didn't die in a hospital bed. He didn't die of old age, surrounded by grandchildren. He was vaporized in the middle of the ocean, doing his duty, serving a country that was still debating whether he was equal to the white men dying beside him. The water closes over the wreck of the Liscum Bay. The silence returns to the Pacific, and just like that, the man who defied the Empire at Pearl Harbor is gone. But the problem wasn't just that he died. The problem was that the Navy didn't know how to tell the world that their poster boy was gone. Doris Miller was gone, vaporized into the ether of the Pacific. But you cannot kill a symbol with a torpedo. When the Liscum Bay went down, the Navy tried to keep it quiet. They delayed the announcement. They feared that the death of their poster boy would crush the morale of the black community, but they underestimated the power of what Miller had already started. He had lit a fuse that could not be extinguished. Because of what Miller did on that Sunday morning in 1941, the argument that black men lacked the courage or technical skill for combat was dead. It had been shot full of holes by a .50 caliber machine gun. In 1944, just months after Miller's death, the Navy commissioned the USS Mason. For the first time, a warship was manned by a predominantly black crew. Then came the Golden 13, the first black officers in Navy history, and in 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially ending segregation in the United States Armed Forces. Miller didn't live to see any of it. He didn't see the black officers wearing the insignia he was told he could never earn. He didn't see the integrated mess halls. He remained frozen in 1943, a cook third class, but his spirit was in every signature, every promotion, and every barrier that came crashing down. Fast forward to the 20th of January 2020, Martin Luther King Jr. Day. The United States Navy makes an announcement that shakes the foundation of naval tradition. They announce the construction of the newest Ford-class aircraft carrier, CVN-81. Usually, these floating cities, the most powerful machines ever built by human hands, are named after presidents: Washington, Lincoln, Kennedy, Ford. But CVN-81 would not be named after a politician. It would not be named after an admiral. It would be named the USS Doris Miller. Think about the scale of that paradox. A man who was not allowed to look an officer in the eye, a man who was told his only value was scrubbing dishes, now has his name welded onto 100,000 tons of nuclear-powered steel. It is the ultimate apology. It is the ultimate vindication. But before you let the swelling music of victory take over, we need to look at the cost. We need to go back to a small house in Waco, Texas, in the winter of 1943. The war ends. The parades happen. The confetti falls in Times Square. Sailors come home to kiss their wives and hold their children. But on the Miller family porch, there is no reunion. There is only a piece of paper. The symbolic object, a yellow Western Union telegram. It is thin. It is fragile. It smells of dust and dry paper. But to Henrietta Miller, Dory's mother, it weighs more than an aircraft carrier. The Secretary of the Navy regrets to inform you. There is no body to bury. There is no grave to visit. There is just this piece of paper and a box containing the Navy Cross. Miller died a hero to the world. But to his mother, he just stopped coming home. He died without knowing he was a hero. He died thinking he was still just a cook who got lucky once. He died before the civil rights movement really began. He never saw the dream he helped finance with his own blood. The tragedy of Doris Miller isn't that he died. It's that he spent his last moments on Earth serving a country that still wouldn't let him sit at the front of the bus. The Navy gave him a medal, and eventually they gave him a ship, but they never gave him the one thing he truly fought for: his humanity. That telegram sits in a drawer, a silent receipt for a debt that America can never fully repay. 15 minutes. In the grand, bloody timeline of World War II, 15 minutes is nothing. It is a blink of an eye. It is a rounding error. But in those specific 15 minutes, on the deck of a dying battleship, Doris Miller didn't just fight a war. He dismantled a lie that had stood for 2 centuries. Let's look at the data one last time. 1 man, 0 training, 4 to 6 enemy aircraft destroyed. But the most important number isn't the planes he shot down from the sky. The most important number is 0. That is the number of valid excuses the United States Navy had left to keep black men out of combat. Miller didn't just load a Browning .50 caliber machine gun. He loaded the argument for equality. When he squeezed that butterfly trigger, he wasn't just firing at the Imperial Japanese Navy. He was firing at the idea that a black man was only good for shining shoes and peeling potatoes. He was firing at the very concept of second class. This is the ultimate paradox of the American experience in World War II. The first great hero of the Pacific conflict was a man who, back home in Texas, couldn't sit at a lunch counter. He saved the lives of officers who, in civilian life, might not have even shaken his hand. He fought to save a constitution that did not fully protect him, and he did it without hesitation. Now, let's zoom out. Look at the timeline. Miller died in 1943. He vanished into the dark water of the Gilbert Islands. But 5 years later, President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, ending segregation in the military forever. Miller never saw it, but make no mistake, his finger was on the pen just as much as it was on the trigger. For 80 years, his physical legacy was a small, cold piece of metal, the Navy Cross, sitting in a velvet box in a small house in Waco, a quiet receipt for a life given. But today, that legacy has transformed. It has grown from a medal in a drawer to a floating city on the ocean, the USS Doris Miller, CVN 81. It will be the only aircraft carrier in the history of the United States Navy named after an enlisted sailor, not a president, not an admiral, not a politician, a cook. 100,000 tons of nuclear-powered steel, billions of dollars in technology, carrying thousands of lives, all bearing the name of the man who wasn't allowed to fire a gun. When that ship eventually cuts through the waves of the Pacific, it won't just carry fighter jets. It will carry a ghost. It will carry the spirit of a man who proved that heroism is not a rank, it is not a uniform, and it certainly isn't a color. Heroism is a choice made in the chaos, when the rules say stop, but your soul says go. Doris Miller is no longer just a memory lost at sea. He is the titan he was always meant to be. History is fragile. It is not written in stone anymore. It is written in algorithms. For 80 years, the story of Doris Miller was kept alive by a whisper campaign, by newspapers, by families, by people who refused to let the silence win. Today, that battleground has shifted. It is no longer about ink and paper. It is about data and attention. If this story shook you, if you felt the heat of that gun barrel and the weight of that injustice, do not leave this page quietly. The algorithm is indifferent. It will bury this story under a mountain of cat videos and dance trends unless you prove that it matters. By hitting that like button, you aren't just boosting a video, you are casting a vote against oblivion. You are digitally saluting a man who died without a proper goodbye. You are telling the system, we remember. And I have a question for you, the community of truth seekers. Doris Miller was a hero hiding in plain sight, disguised as a servant. Who is the Dory Miller in your life? Who is the person doing the heavy lifting, saving the day, and getting absolutely zero credit for it? Tell us their story in the comments. Let's turn this comment section into a monument for the unsung. And if you want to join us as we continue to dig up the bodies that history tried to hide, hit that subscribe button. We are just getting started. This channel doesn't just tell stories. We excavate the truth. We believe that the most powerful lessons are often found in the footnotes, in the margins, and in the faces of the people who were never supposed to be the main character. Doris Miller started his day collecting laundry and ended it changing the course of the United States Navy. He proved that greatness does not ask for permission. It does not wait for a rank. It steps forward when the world is falling apart. Somewhere in the deep, dark waters off the Gilbert Islands, the hull of the Liscum Bay is rusting away. The ocean has claimed the body of the cook from Waco, Texas, but his watch is not over. As long as we speak his name, as long as we carry his fire, Doris Miller is still on duty.